Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Are American officials and scientists starting to believe that the coronavirus pandemic came from a lab accident in Wuhan? Let's get to the bottom line. Does it even matter how the pandemic began? Isn't it more important to figure out how to end the disease that has wiped out more than 3.7 million people worldwide, and it's still spreading? For China, the case is closed. COVID-19 jumped from animals to humans in late 2019, period. And I might add that some folks in China pushed a conspiracy theory that the U.S. military hatched it and released it in China. Last year's investigations focused on a wet market in Wuhan that sold seafood and exotic animals for human consumption. The World Health Organization and many scientists agreed with this theory, even though there are still a lot of lingering questions. When former President Donald Trump talked about the possibility of an accident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it was generally dismissed as a conspiracy theory tinged with racism. But now President Joe Biden is asking his intelligence agencies to look into that very possibility. And China says Washington is now just playing politics. So how do we responsibly investigate the origins of COVID without political blinders? Today, we're speaking with Dr. Gigi Gronvall, an immunologist at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and the author of Synthetic Biology, Safety, Security, and Promise. She's a member of the Threat Reduction Advisory Committee, which advises the Defense Department on how to reduce the risk of nuclear, biological, chemical, and conventional threats. And Jamie Metzl, who writes about the future of technology, healthcare, and geopolitics. And he's the author of a great book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. He's a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. It's great to have you both with us today. And Jamie, let me just start with you. You know, if you were sitting in China and during the tenure of President Trump, a lot of these theories, about the virus coming from the Wuhan lab being, geoengineered and even released by the Chinese military to their own people, I think a lot of that was discounted largely by the media. Now President Biden is in, and some of these theories are coming back. I guess you know Asia really well. My question is, from China's perspective, wouldn't you expect a little whiplash in their response?
It depends on where in China. I certainly believe that there are many senior people in China who recognize what happened here, and that is whatever the origins of the pandemic, and there's a legitimate debate and a legitimate conversation right now about whether it emerged naturally, zoonotic jump from animals to humans, or through some kind of lab incident. It's a very real question. It's an honest question. You mentioned in your intro, Steve, that the World Health Organization has sided with the natural origin hypothesis, which is 100%, as much as I love you, it's 100% untrue. Dr. Tedros has said that the WHO supports the investigation of all hypotheses, including the possibility of a lab incident origin. So if I were in China, I would be a little worried right now because I would know that the Chinese government has carried out a massive cover-up from day one. Immediately, they started destroying samples, disappearing critical records, imprisoning citizen journalists, asking the most basic questions. And they established a universal gag order preventing Chinese scientists from saying or writing anything publicly about pandemic origins without prior government approval. And so I don't think it's whiplash. I just think that you're right that the world, many of us in the United States, and I'm a progressive Democrat, got in the habit of just assuming that everything that President Trump said was just some kind of fabrication or lie or whatever. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. And that's why I've been saying we need to evaluate the message, not the messenger. And I think right now there are two very valid origin hypotheses. And that's why I've always called for a full investigation so we can get to the bottom of what went wrong and then address our greatest vulnerabilities. I
mean, it's a fascinating challenge, and it's a mystery, sort of like a whodunit. And one would think of that line of, well, if China is innocent of this, why do they behave so guiltily? But let me ask Dr. Gronvall a moment. Can you share with us where some of your skepticism comes of at least that path of looking at this pandemic's escape, if you will, into mankind?
Sure, happy to. So a lot of the theories about where COVID came from come from either that it was originally in animals and made the jump somehow to humans, or that it was actually created in a laboratory. And I think that the evidence for that latter, that it was created in a laboratory, is very weak. And so there's a lot of problems with that idea. One of the issues is that people, I think, put a lot of, I mean, I think science is amazing, but it's often a lot more incremental and tedious than I think a lot of people think. And so a lot of the discussions over what is possible in the laboratory to create put a lot of faith in science that should not be put into it quite yet. That scientists could basically wave a magic wand and create a virus of this type. Right now, there's a serious investigation that we need to have for the origin of this virus, but we need to do a lot more science and a lot more exploration to figure out where this virus could have been derived from.
Well, let me ask Jamie and both of you together. I mean, one of the critiques you offer in this paper was that when it comes to genetic editing and genetic design, a topic that Jamie Metzl knows a lot about, that we're not yet at the point in our collective knowledge in science and how to microengineer those changes in genes in a way that would produce, very fine results as of yet. We're going in that direction, but your argument is that we're not there yet. Jamie, are we there yet, and we just don't collectively know it?
No, so I completely agree with what Gigi has just said. For the people who think that a bunch of scientists in China sat down and they brought out all of their best CRISPR tools, and they just built, using the tools of synthetic biology, some kind of this actual virus, and then unleashed it on the world. That's a very futuristic idea. Maybe in 20 years, 50 years, that'll be possible. It's certainly not possible now. But that's why I think a lot of people have gotten confused with this conflation of the idea of a genetically engineered bioweapon with the idea, well, maybe could there have been a very small genome edit just of what's called the furin cleavage site, and there's a big debate about that happening right now. But you don't even need to go to the point of assuming that there was any genome editing to make the lab incident hypothesis possible. It could be something as simple as people from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan CDC going down to one of these bat-infested caves in Yunnan in southern China and being infected, and just the humans being the vectors. It could have easily been the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses. They were doing things like called serial passage, which are just exposures of viruses to other cell cultures, to ACE2 knock-in humanized mice. It could easily have been that there were a lot of different permutations, and one of them was one that was more able to jump to humans, and somebody in the lab was infected and just accidentally walked it out. There was some problem of waste disposal. And so I think we don't have to go all the way to a genetically bioengineered virus to raise the very legitimate questions of an accidental lab incident.
Well, I think this raises, Gigi, some of the dimensions of lab protocols, lab safety. We do apparently understand, and I don't have the report, but there are the accusations in some of the intelligence reports done by the U.S. government that 3 individuals became sick in November of 2019, and that there was another case prior to that Dr. Anthony Fauci has asked to look into, which is a number of people who became sick after investigating a cave some time ago. And so what of Jamie's speculation that there could be something along these lines that may still be tagged to the lab, but may be less diabolical?
I think that the only way that a laboratory accident origin makes sense with knowing the science that we have is if it was just like Jamie described, where a virus was taken from the natural world and was examined in a laboratory and came out somehow. I still think that the natural introduction is probably more likely, but that's what an investigation is for. However, I don't think that we are going to be able to satisfy everybody's curiosity to be able to get to that level of certainty. We have to take the word of what has been put forward. Right now, we have heard, it's been in the news for months, that the people who worked in the lab had serology tests and had not been exposed to COVID prior to the pandemic. So we either take that or retest, or I don't know how one would get to greater certainty than that declaration. I think there are more things, though, that can be done scientifically that we're not doing to be able to better underscore, to figure out where this came from. And that is to do more sampling of the environment and to be able to trace back some of where the animals came from. And those leads are going to go cold if they're not cold already. And so I think it would be nice to see more of an effort that we all work together to be able to find the origin in the natural world and then see where that takes us.
Well, let me ask
Steve.
Oh, please.
Yeah, let me just jump in there. I'm all for additional testing, and for sure we should do all kinds of testing and sampling in the natural world because, as I've said, that's one very legitimate hypothesis. But one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about, and I think we need to do much more to examine the lab incident hypothesis, is that everything that Gigi said is contingent upon our essentially trusting the word of Shi Zhengli and a small number of people at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In an ideal world, on day one of the pandemic, Dr. Shi and others would have said, please, international community, however organized, come in and review our records, look at the lab notes. Look at the databases of what viruses we did or didn't have in our repository. If at that time, let's just say on day one, we knew that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had SARS-CoV-2 or a possible precursor virus to it in their repository, that would be game over. We would know that the origin is a lab incident. If, on the other hand, we had full access, we knew everything that was happening there. She has said that there was no Chinese military engagement at WIV, although every U.S. intelligence agency has asserted that there was. So there are major questions about Shi Zhengli, the legitimacy and her credibility and accountability. Right. These serology tests that Gigi mentioned were taken way after the potential exposures. So the Chinese cover-up and the destruction of evidence, that's, in my view, that's the problem. These aren't unanswerable questions. They just can't be answered without a full process for looking into them. And when the international study team was in China, people think it was an investigation. They were on the ground for 4 weeks, 2 weeks in quarantine, and then 2 weeks for a highly curated, manipulated study tour, including a visit to the COVID propaganda museum. And then at the end of their 2 weeks, they did a vote on which hypotheses were more or less likely. And they did it by a show of hands where the Chinese scientists had to raise their hands in front of the Chinese party commissars. And they all knew that people who'd asked basic questions had been put in prison. So do you think one of those scientists could have raised their hand and said, yeah, I think a lab incident origin is possible. We should look into that. I mean, I think that's all of this exists within a context.
Gigi, you look like you want to respond.
Yeah, I think I just want to caution your viewers about a concept that we call mirror imaging. So this is something that we thought about a lot when it was the U.S. As it had an adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union. And the whole idea was looking at the Soviets and saying, why are they doing this? Well, they must be doing it this way for this reason. And that whole idea could be false if you are making your enemy or your adversary a little bit more like you. So all I want to caution your viewers is to say that sometimes China is going to behave in a particular way that may not have anything to do with whether or not they are covering up this particular incident. And it's important when you're looking at the discussion of where this virus came from that we still push the science and push what we know and not what we think we know about or what we presume to be why China's acting the way that they are.
Well,
I've often said that like a bat could have come out of a cave wearing a name tag, speaking English, infected somebody and posted on Insta, and people would, China may act exactly the same way. And even if the origin was clear as a bell.
Let me just say a few moments, just a little bit on what Gigi said. I don't think that's just China being China should be any way that we should think about this issue, because we have this terrible, in my view, very likely avoidable pandemic. There's this terrible cover-up. We can't get into that's just China being China and saying, oh, transparency and accountability, that's just our thing. We should just let them do their thing. If they want to put 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, that's just China being China. I think I totally reject that. I think your second point is a very important point. We are entering the age of synthetic biology. Gigi wrote a great book about that. And then the core message of this era is that our species has the increasing ability to read, write, and hack the code of life. And over time, we're going to have a much greater ability to manipulate all of life, including viruses, and including, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, however many years. And so we need to be thinking about this. And that's why we need to be learning the tough lessons. That's why we need to be doing everything we can to understand how this pandemic started and how we can be much better prepared for the next ones.
All I mean is that one should not assume that the origin of the virus has anything to do with the way that China is acting, and we need to make sure that we separate out the science from other considerations. But it is true that synthetic biology and biology in general this is the science of this century, and a lot of nations are looking towards biology as a way to lift their economies and to provide not only medicines, but materials and manufacturing and everything else for the next several decades. So countries are pouring a lot of money into the biosciences. And so we have to think of different ways that we can keep biosafety funded, that we can encourage good norms and be able to have the kind of safety systems in place so that people are appropriately flagged you might not be able to stop it, but at least halt some of the incidents like the CRISPR baby experiments.
Right.
So this is it's a nebulous kind of governance for sure, because you can't tell other nations what precisely they are doing, but we do have treaties, we do have norms, we do have engagements, we have publications. There are lots of different layers and ways that we can try and promote our vision of how science should be operating.
Thank you for that.
Steve,
yeah. Please.
If I could just jump in, that's why I think there's a through line between the CRISPR babies, and it's an open question whether they even got greater future resistance to HIV, which is doubtful. But there's a through line between the He CRISPR baby issue, right, and this, and a lot of other things that are happening. And there are two pieces of it. One is that science and our biggest challenges are global, but we're not organized to address global challenges, and that mismatch is increasingly dangerous. The second is that
China, the challenge, if I may, of non-state actors, right? So this is a non-state actor doing this. There's a difference between what governments and militaries are organizing to do and what individuals who are entrepreneurial and think they're going to tackle something with new technologies are doing.
The non-state actors go. I mean, if you all the states that have navies probably looked at what happened with the USS Theodore Roosevelt and said, that is terrible. We've got to do something about our defense. But a non-state actor to be able to take a symbol of American power and reduce it to a hospital ship, I mean, that's potent, and that's something that we need to be worried about.
Let me ask, Jamie, let me ask you a question. You have written a lot about your concerns about a guy named Peter Daiszak and the Eco Health Alliance. And Anthony Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has said, hey, you know, the U.S. government has helped fund some of his work, the Defense Department, and if you could do bat surveillance and be involved in that, that's a good thing. It would be irresponsible not to. What are your concerns about Peter Daiszak, if you can give us a brief catch-up on that?
So Peter Daiszak is one of the world's premier, we'll call him a virus hunter, people who believe that we need to have surveillance to understand these viruses that are out there, and we can't just bury our head in the sand. And he was actually one of the heroes of the effort to track down the origins of the first SARS outbreak. The reason why I have become, I've moved from being a big fan of his in the past to a big critic of his now, are essentially two things. First, he was the organizer of a letter in the British journal, The Lancet, in February of last year, which claimed, without sufficient supporting evidence, that this outbreak almost certainly or very likely stemmed from natural origins, and called anybody who was even raising the possibility of a lab incident origin a conspiracy theorist. I've called that scientific propaganda. I've called it thuggery. I've even called for the editor-in-chief of The Lancet to be fired, because I think it was not appropriate to use that kind of language when we needed to have an open, honest conversation. Second, Peter, who already we know through emails, access through Right to Know, was highly manipulated in that process and trying to create the impression of unanimity and didn't disclose any conflicts of interest. Then he was a member of both the WHO organized but not led study team and the Lancet Commission. And I think he just has a massive conflict of interest as someone who has funded the work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that's now being brought into question.
Well, thank you. Well, Gigi, I'd love your comments on that, whether it's about Peter Daiszak, but also on the broader side of the scientific commons globally, and how, you know, that, I mean, these don't follow national lines, is my impression. How can we make sure that remains healthy and robust and serving the public interest? I'm going to give you the last word.
So I think that there's a lot that we need to learn from this. And one of the things I've been struck by is just how small a group of people have been making this their career, to be able to investigate new viruses. We should be doing a lot more of this and making sure, seeing what we can do to stop pandemics, not just make vaccines really quickly once they come upon us. So I think that means opening this up to being a bigger field, having more engagement between scientists working worldwide. We have seen pretty clearly that infectious diseases don't know borders, and putting our head in the sand is not going to change that. You know, diseases will come if we don't do what we can to stop spillovers.
Well, I'd like to thank Johns Hopkins University immunologist Dr. Gigi Gronvall and writer and technology futurologist Jamie Metzl. Thank you both for being with us today. I really wish we could have these kinds of conversations whenever we have a conversation. It's very, very good to talk to you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
You.
So what's the bottom line? In relations between superpowers, there's no such thing as an innocent question. It'd be absolutely fabulous to think that the world is open to unshackled scientific inquiry just for the sake of science and human curiosity. But here in the real world, everything consequential gets shackled by politics. Sometimes there are good folks trying to help the whole world come out on top of this process, but that's not always how it works. If the U.S. government is challenging China's version of the truth, it will be seen as an act of aggression. And for some reason or other, China has done a lot to blur the origins of COVID and to muzzle those who knew something about the early days of the killer virus. So politics aside, identifying the source of the pandemic is vital to fighting the next, whether we'd like to or not. The consequences for mankind are staggering, and that's the bottom line.